Today, a group called Muslims in the American Public Square released a poll of American Muslims on their demographics, religious practices, and views about September 11th. It's about an hour and 20 minutes.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zahid Bukhari. I'm the director of Project MAPS, Muslims in American Public Square. And today we are releasing the result of American Muslim poll, the first ever systematic poll of American Muslim community. So we have, what we'll do is I will present some highlights of the data, and then Professor Sulayman Nyang and Professor John Esposito, they will give their perspective on these data. But before that, we are fortunate that Dr. Kimon Sargeant from the Pew Charitable Trust, the religion program, he is here, and he's very kind enough to come all the way from Philadelphia to join us with us in this press briefing. And Pew Charitable Trust is basically funding or supporting this project, and they have the bigger initiative. So first I would like to invite Dr. Kimon Sargeant to introduce the Pew initiative in this religious communities and the American Public Square.
Good morning. My name is Kimon Sargeant, and I work in the religion program at the Pew Charitable Trust. I'll be very brief because I want to turn it over to the very interesting and exciting results from this poll. Just wanted to let you know that this is part of an initiative of 7 similar projects looking at how major American religious communities are engaging and participating in American civic life. So in addition to this project, the project's looking at how the Catholics, mainline Protestants, evangelicals, African-American churches, Latinos, and the Jewish community are participating, and they all have surveys and other types of ways of looking at the diverse ways in which America's religious communities are contributing to our common life. But today's subject is this great new survey on American Muslims. I know there's been a lot of writing about the Muslim community, but I've never seen anything like this poll that has some really definitive data on both countries of origins and the many ways in which Muslims in America are engaging in the public square. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the folks here who have been working very hard to develop this good information. Thank you.
The Project MAPS, Muslims in American Public Square, we started in 1999. And as in our media advisory, we are housed at the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding at Georgetown University. And the project is working under the supervision of Professor John Esposito. Other than this poll, there is multiple activities we are doing. What we are looking for, that there should be 2 edited volumes, and around 35 scholars of Islam and scholars of Islam in America, they are writing chapters. We are also compiling 2 reference tools. One is Who among American Muslim community, and another one is the Directory of the Islamic Centers and Muslim Organizations. So we are working on those 3 things also. And in between, it was planned that we will do this survey. September 11th definitely highlights the importance of Muslims community here, and a lot of significance is there. How we done this survey, just about the methodology, we commissioned the Zogby International and their staff, and they did the telephone interview. What we did, that we have a basic list of Islamic centers and those places where the Jummah prayer, the Friday prayers, are being offered. It's more than 2,000 listing, and we sorted them out according to zip code, and then randomly selected 300 Islamic centers all over the country. Basic assumption was that the Muslim community is around those Islamic centers. They are living around or the vicinity of those Islamic centers. So we provided that list to the Zogby International, their technical staff, those zip codes. They took those zip codes and also the adjoining zip codes and came up with the telephone listing, the general telephone listing. Then also they have a very huge Muslim-like name, surname list. And they applied Muslim-like name list on those general telephone listing. And then we came up with the universe of Muslims' names all over the country on 300 locations. And then they interviewed 5 to 7 people on each location. We also thought when we are creating that methodology that our Afro-American brothers, because they don't change name legally, so they will not be fully represented in this telephone poll. So we did additional interviewing in Detroit, in New York, in Washington, D.C., in Atlanta area, just to compensate that their more number should be in this survey. So, and then the questionnaires were developed, and they did the telephone interviewing and also in-person interviewing on one weekend in those 5 cities. So we have now 1,781 respondents, and their responses we calculated in all those reports you have in your hand. The basic questions which we like to answer, one is the very fundamental, who are the Muslims? That's the questions, number one. What they think about social political issues and how they behave in the social and the political arena. What is the level of religiosity among the Muslim community? And then about post-September 11, how they are feeling and how they are reacting to September 11th and its aftermath. So these are the basic areas. We developed the questions and we got the answers. So very quickly I will go through the first page 4 and 5. This is the sample characteristics of the basic table of the Muslim community representing the Muslim community. And here I think just the main point, for example, about ethnicity. We have this breakdown that the South Asian, and among South Asian we have Pakistani, Indian, Bangladesh, and Afghani. South Asian are 32%, Arab population is 26%, Afro-American 20%, African 7%, and all others 14%. And also it was mentioned in the highlights that when we asked where you were born, so Muslims, they reported they were born in 80 different countries. So we have representation of 80 different countries, including USA, in this survey. About gender, the 59 and 40%, and then the marital status, age group, relatively is young, 50%. They are under 50 years of age. Education, relatively very high educated community. For example, 58% they have college graduation, and only 6% has less than high school graduation. Income, again, the whole community means the 50% of the sample, or the 50% of the population of American Muslims, they are earning more than $50,000 a year. And then occupation. Another one is the year, especially we also ask the questions. It will in other sections, whether you are born here or born outside. So 36% told us that they were born here, and then the rest of them, they were born in other countries. And those who were born in other countries, they immigrated in pre-1970, 12%, the decade of 70s, 25, decade of 80s, 36, and 1990 to present, 24. 79% they are registered voters, and among them, 85% are very likely to vote. The party affiliation, Muslims are 40% Democrats, 23% Republican, 28% Independent. So these are the basic about the answering the question, who are the Muslims, about their characteristics, about their demographics. Then about what they think and how they behave. About this, I already told the party affiliation about the voting. The majority of Afro-American, 55%, they voted for Gore, while the majority, 54% of Arabs and 49% of South Asian, they voted for Bush. A majority of Pakistanis among South Asian, 56%, also voted for Bush. And among Afro-American, also 20%, they voted for Bush. About the ideology, when we ask, over a third, 36% of American Muslims describe themselves as moderate in terms of their political ideology. Over 1/4 say they are liberal to very liberal. 1/5 say they are conservative to very conservative. Then there is a set of questions about participation in the mainstream American life. For example, I think it's on page 12, there's a table 1, political activity, called or written the media or politicians on a given issue, or have you signed a petition? There's a full table on that. So here we also have ranked them. The 50% said yes, and to 45% said change your lifestyle in support of a cause like the environment. Attended a rally in support of a politician or a cause, 40%, down to 30% participated in a boycott of a product or a business. Importance of politics, that's the second table. Very important. I think the 82% saying that is very important. And also 85% are saying that they discuss politics with family and with their children. Another, I think, important table is about how they behave in the mainstream, the involvement in the community activities. That's on page 15. And here, again, we rank them up. And we ask, I think, a battery of questions about different organizational or different social structure where they are involved. Any organization to help the poor, sick, elderly, or homeless, that's the number 1, 77%. And any mosque or other religious organization, 71%. One reporter was asking me, I was telling her that the significant thing is that Muslims are more involved in religious institution. More than that, they are involved in the elderly, with poor, with homeless, with sick people, their activities. And then we have school of or youth program, any professional organization, down to any trade or labor union, only 17% they are involved. Another, again, in the mainstream or the public square, we asked their different statement and whether they agreed or not. Muslims should donate to non-Muslim social service programs like Aid for Homeless, and Muslims should be involved in American civic and community development organizations to improve America. Muslims should participate in the political process. More than 90%, 93, 96, 96%, they are agreeing this statement that Muslims definitely they should be involved. They should be involved in the civic organizations and giving non-Muslim a social service program. And down to another question, America is an immoral society. Again, 37% they are agreeing and 54% they are disagreeing with this statement. Another section also about this, page 18, we asked about 18 to 20 questions relating September 11th and its aftermath. I think the very highlight is mainly Muslims are saying that the American foreign policy is the main cause for these type of attacks. And if America change its foreign policy, these type of attacks should be avoided. Then when we asked about the President Bush handling, 58% saying about the President Bush handling of the terrorist attack, 58% they have positive opinion, 38% they have negative opinion. When we asked how confident are you of President Bush's ability to handle this crisis, 57% are confident, 40% they are nervous. Another question about in the aftermath of September 11 attack, do you feel the U.S. is fighting a war on terrorism or a war against Islam? 67% of American Muslims, they are saying that America is waging a war against terrorism, and 18% are saying that it's a war against Islam. And then when we ask about the military action in Afghanistan, the numbers are different. Still there is a support, 51% they are supporting the military action in Afghanistan, and 43% they are against the military action in in Afghanistan. Another issue was also that we asked about the backlash. There's a lot of discussion about backlash against Muslims around the country. We asked these questions, and it's on page 27. Have any individual, businesses, or religious organizations in your community experienced anti-Muslim discrimination since the September 11 attacks? 52% said yes, and 41% said no. And then we asked what type of anti-discrimination experience they had. 25% said verbal abuse, 8% said racial profiling, 6% said physical abuse or assault, 6% destruction of property, 3% denial of employment, 2% boycott of Muslim or Arab-operated business, 7% combination of all of the above. So that's around half of the Muslim population, they experience some type of indiscrimination in post-September 11. Then on 28, there's a bunch of domestic issues where generally national population and different groups, we asked the Muslim opinion. And over there, I think it's very interesting that it's difficult to pigeonhole Muslims in one direction. In some issues like poverty, like health insurance, they are for big government, and some other issues, they are very, very much conservative-like opinion. So Muslims are in between that. Issue by issue, they have their opinion. For example, on this favor, oppose domestic issues, 96% are saying eliminating all forms of racial discrimination. 94% are saying providing universal health care for citizens. 93% are saying providing more generous government assistance to the poor. 92% saying stricter laws and regulation to protect the environment. So 87% increasing foreign aid for poor countries, 84% stronger laws to fight terrorism, and 79% making it more difficult for people to buy guns, 74% more cuts in the income tax. So it's the Muslim opinion on different issues. They are to some extent, the American Democrats are liberal on some issues, and Republican are conservative on certain other issues. About their religiosity, that's another issue was there. And the nutshell of there are several questions we asked. The importance of religion and spirituality is very much there. But around 2/3 Muslims, they are very much, they pray regularly, either daily 5 prayers or some of the daily 5 prayers. Around 22% they are saying that they pray like occasionally, maybe the Eid prayer annually. And around 12 to 13% they are accepting that they are not praying at all. So these are the here. And then when we ask about involvement in their mosque, in their religious institutions, half of the Muslim population or the sample, they are very much involved, actively involved in their mosque, and others they are not. When we asked another question about the role of mosque, whether the mosque should speak up on the political issues, so they are saying, the majority is saying yes, mosque and masajid, they should speak up on the political issues. When we asked the khatib, the person or the imam who is giving sermon over there, he should speak up about the candidate or issues, then the majority is saying that he should not. So that's the behavior to some extent. I think I was looking at other general population survey, almost similar style, that yes, the church should do that, but the priest, he should not do that. So these are a type of, over there, again, they have about the religiosity. So these are the some means the highlights. There are more. There are more perspective should be put forward on those numbers. But basically, the point is that with this project and with this support from Pew and support from the Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding and also Zogby International, we were able to first time systematically grab the opinion of the American Muslim population, systematic way, their opinion, their behavior, their attitudes, their thinking, their feeling, and then we can continue to analyze and give more perspective about these feelings. So now I will request Professor John Esposito. He will also speak on the perspective of that data.
Great, thank you. I'm going to be very brief, but I just want to frame this a little. I mean, some of you probably have a perspective within which to see this, and some may not. And part of the reason why we at the Center were excited about this project when we talked with Pew about bringing it to Georgetown was not simply that the Center deals with the relationship of the Muslim world in the West, and therefore we have to be concerned about Muslims in the West, in America, as well as it were, Islam overseas. But more importantly, the fact is that we just don't have the kind of information about Muslims in America that we have about any other group. And I think that the way in which you can realize it would be, those of you who are reporters, there are a lot of things that you simply don't know that you should know, that you would expect that given the size of the Muslim population you would know. I mean, you'd know comparable things about Catholics, Protestants, or Jews if you deal with religion. And if you don't know, what you do about all those other groups is go to the library and look up a reference work. Fact is, you can't find any of this information. We don't have the basic information. And we discovered when we first did a kind of background paper for Pew, we looked at the number of mosques in the Virginia-Washington area. So you get in touch with Muslim organizations, they give you a list, you then check, and you discover that 30 to 40% don't exist anymore. And then you discover there are another 30 or 40% of new ones that do exist. And there you are in terms of your kind of information base. I think that in many ways, I'm delighted that with the timing of this release, because in a kind of interesting kind of way, we're having the press conference and releasing the results right around a time when we're celebrating Hanukkah, Christmas, and the Eid, which really puts in a kind of symbolic way where Islam is as the third largest religion. And yet, I think the inability that we continue to have, we can't even agree on how many Muslims there are in America. I just proofread, I can't get specific about this, a book that's going to be used by one of the major publishers in the United States for children. And in it, it tells us that there are, and this will make some of my friends very happy, 14 million Muslims in America. I mean, we play the exponential game, and I'm looking and thinking, you know, who's done this? You know, I mean, it's so you start talking about numbers, you start talking about Muslim attitudes. Even now, when I talk to people about how did Muslims vote, they don't know how to break it out in terms of national elections. And certainly in light of September 11th, I mean, part of the reality we have to face is that however wonderful it is that the president and our senior politicians and indeed most religious leaders have distinguished between mainstream Islam and terrorism, the reality of it is, if you look at media coverage, the media irresistibly, constantly comes back to the issue of Islam, violence, and terrorism. The most recent example was 60 Minutes the other night. Andy Rooney's, the best way to characterize it, and I'm a fan of Andy Rooney's, scurrilous comments about Islam and Muslims. I mean, it was terrific to have Mr. Rooney tell us that he curled up with the Quran for a couple of weeks, and now he was going to give us his enlightened opinion based on a selective pulling out of some text. And I think in light of September 11th, it becomes that much more important. The fact that West Wing did a very quick new program that it ran a month ago and a number of others did, you know, in responding to September 11th. And if you look at the kind of issues, the fact that last night JAG got into, I think, jihad groups or something. I heard a kind of commercial for it. We need to know more about how Muslims, who they are, how they feel about things, what they think. And often for those of us that have been doing interviews, over the years, let alone in light of September 11th, you constantly have those questions coming up all the time. And again, the same questions will come up. Why? Because quite naturally, if a reporter calls up, they realize they've done a story, but at the end of the day, how many people did they talk to? So then the question becomes, is there a wider sample, or should we go to another part of the country? Well, I think that, one of the things that my colleagues have accomplished is that we now have, with regard to some basic information with regard to Muslims demographically and their attitudes on a number of issues, we now have a reputable study that has been done. We can move beyond the kind of anecdotal information that most academics give, whether they're Muslim or non-Muslim, and that most Muslims in the community will naturally give. And they will speak in terms of, what they know. My brother is an economist who's quantitative, but he once taught a course on healthcare, and he said the thing that drove him crazy was he finally had to deal with students who would stand up and say, well, wait a minute, I'm African American from this area. What you're saying about healthcare simply isn't true. And what the person was really saying is, my experience in my community is X. That's my world. That's what I believe. Well, that part of the problem we have at times when we want to talk about Muslims in America is that we don't have enough of this kind of information. And I think that this is just the beginning of what will be produced by the MAPS program, by our who's who, by the number of studies that are being done, and simply getting a lot of reference material out there. And I want to congratulate Zahid Bukhari and Sulayman Nyang and Zogby International for bringing this all together. Sulayman.
Now I will request Professor Sulayman Nyang. He's a professor in Harvard University and also director for Project MAPS, Muslims in American Public Square.
Yeah, good morning. We are very pleased to really share these findings with you. As Dr. Bukhari and Professor Esposito explained to you, we have the findings of Zogby International, which is one of the reputable pollsters in the United States, along with Charitable and the others. What I'm going to do really is to contextualize these findings in light of our research. Those of us who have been writing about Muslims for the last 20 years or more, because I think this statistical data, to a large extent, makes it imperative for scholars who write about Muslims to be more scientific. Because much of what we have in the literature, if you go to the library or you go to the Bell and Howell Index, some of you know what Bell and Howell Index is because your newspapers are very much abstracted or indexed in the Bell and Howell Index. What you find is that much of what we know about American Muslims, as Dr. Esposito pointed out, are anecdotal information. And this study, together with coming studies in the future, would shed greater light on the Muslim community. And we will begin to be more authoritative when we speak about Muslims. I just give you a few examples. Several years ago, one of our colleagues with limited funds did a study called Islamic Values in the United States of America. This was done by Professor Ivan Haddad and Professor Loomis at the Hartford Seminary several years ago. And at that time, based on their limited data and limited resources, they pointed out that 10% of the Muslims attend masjid. Now, at that particular time, you can see comparable data from some of the other religious communities in America with respect to church attendance or synagogue attendance. And of course, the Muslim figure was not very far off from some of these figures. But I think what this research has done is to bring out in a more scientific way figures that could help us understand the community. Now, I have about 4 different issues here which I think should be highlighted in light of the research on American Muslim studies. The Muslim image in the media and Hollywood. This is one of the biggest issues, and I'm very sure that we are going to see books written by journalists, especially, or by scholars in the academy, those who are interested in media studies. When Jack Sahin wrote his book, TV Arab, I think the TV Muslim is going to be more much in terms of discussion. And this survey research now provides information for journalists who are seriously interested in getting a scientific picture of Americans to address this particular issue. What our survey reveals here really is that Muslims, this is self-perception, Muslims believe, 77% of the Muslims believe that Hollywood is primarily responsible for negative stereotyping of Muslims, as opposed to 68% of the Muslims who believe that the media is culpable. Now, this is a very interesting development with regard to the situation. I guess here the difference is between print media and videos and films as we see them coming from Hollywood. The other thing that is very important, and this study provides scientific basis for it, and I think some of us who are now looking at comparative religious studies would be able to speak with greater authority when we're in the company of fellow scholars looking at American religion. Muslim immigration to the United States. The statistical data generated by this study made it categorically clear that some of the suspicions some of us have, people like myself, John Esposito, and others, that the Muslim community is basically Muslims who are the children of the Cold War. That means to say, if you look at the history of Islam in the United States, you will see that Muslims were not very numerous in America, but since World War II, the number of Muslims who have migrated to the United States have increased significantly. And of course, Dr. Bukhari pointed out to you the different layers of Muslim migrants, depending on whether they came here in the 60s or before the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And you can see that many of these Muslims who came to the United States were really people fleeing either from the Soviet camp or they were running away from military dictatorships that were supportive of these, of one part of the Cold War or the other, invariably supporting the Soviet Union. So now that we are beginning to have statistical data along this line, we will begin to understand in a more scientific and graphic way the nature of the Muslim community and the manner in which their arrival rate was very much determined by the intensity of the Cold War or by the outbreak of political breakdown in places like Somalia, Afghanistan, Kashmir, Chechnya. Because think about it, in the United States, we did not have many Somalis here as permanent residents. In Northern Virginia alone, according to Northern Virginia official statistics, there are at least 2,000 Somali families living in this part of the world. And if you go to Minneapolis, you have thousands of Somalis who are living there. And you go to San Diego, California, you also have a large haven of Somalis in the United States. These are the children of the Cold War because of what happened in Somalia and how many of them came. And I think our study reveals that the patterns of migration was very much affected by this development. This leads me to the African-American factor in this whole equation. Because when we talk about the Muslim community, we talk about the immigrant Muslims and the African-American Muslims. Of course, there are other native-born Americans, white American Muslims, and you have Hispanics and Asian Americans who are part of the larger Muslim community. But the African-American community, of course, is the most numerous among these native-born Americans. Now, one thing that is very evident from this study is the fact that 60% of the African Americans are converts to Islam, and 39% of these African Americans belong to second and third generation Muslims. Now, this is very important information because what it reveals is that Islam is not only something that African Americans accepted today. We know from historical research about the Muslim community in America that there were African American Sunni Muslims long before the Nation of Islam emerged in Detroit and Chicago in the 1930s. So those families, the 39% that we identify with African Americans who are second or third generation, you find that many of those people have developed characteristics that are very similar to some of the more affluent immigrant Muslims, in the sense that they are very Republican. And this would explain the 20% vote of African Americans for Bush, because that category of African American voters identified in this study would definitely belong to those African Americans who have been what I call bourgeoisified. That means to say they have become more bourgeois-like by virtue of their greater involvement with the American economy and their own success stories in accomplishing things American. Now, the study also revealed that 19% of American Muslims are converts. That suggests that the number of white Americans, Hispanics, and others who are joining the Muslim community have not been widely noted. And I think this 19% of conversion would be very interesting to observe, given the fact that the 60% of African Americans who converted to Islam are really people who converted in a lifetime. So you have if you go back, you can see that since the 30s, there are still elements in Afro-America who converted to Islam by virtue of the Nation of Islam or some of the various Sunni-oriented African-American Islamic community. Now, this leads me to the degree of spirituality. I think it has become very evident from this study that that Muslims generally, immigrant or African American, have developed a high degree of spirituality. So in this regard, other Pew studies relating to other religious communities would provide very interesting data to make comparison with regard to degree and level of spirituality across the board. So you can now begin to link Muslims to other groups like Jews and Catholics and Christian evangelicals, Black Christians and Hispanic Christians. So now this data allows us now to go back and look at those data generated by scholars studying these other groups. The last area I want to deal with really is with regard to foreign policy and the manner in which these statistical data we have reflect Muslim sentiments and Muslim opinions in the United States. And I think these statistical findings are very critical in terms of future U.S. policies in various parts of the world, especially the Middle East. 84% agree that the U.S. support a Palestinian state. So what Secretary of State Colin Powell and the President himself, President Bush, state about the rights of the Palestinians to have their own state apparently receive 84% endorsement within the Muslim community. 70% of these Muslims are also critical of U.S. support for Israel. Now, this is very important in the context of Muslim Americans or American Muslim perception of U.S. policy and American Muslim attitude towards supporters of Israel. And I think this is something that Muslim leaders and Jewish leaders should begin to really address in terms of making sure that there is some kind of convergence and discussion in this regard. Those of us who are in the interfaith movement are very much struck by this figure, and we would certainly like to see bridges built so that we can begin to narrow the differences between the communities. I'm sure if you look at the statistics for the Jewish community, you might very well have comparable figures saying support Israel. So I think what has to happen is to make sure that these data, which shows that there is cognitive dissonance between these two communities, must begin to be addressed by those who are seriously interested in bringing about peace in the Middle East. The other point which is very important, and I think those of us who look at the American Muslim position vis-a-vis U.S. policy in the Muslim world are struck by this fact. 61% of the Muslims who are polled by Zogby International feel that the U.S. government should reduce support for undemocratic governments. This is a very important point right now, because what it means is that many of the Muslims would like to see to it that democratization in the Muslim world is encouraged by the United States. Now, this has not been the case because of Cold War consideration. But I think now that you have this sizable number of American Muslims who go and vote, insisting on this, they could very well begin to form alliances with other people across the board in the United States who are seriously interested in the democratic movement abroad. The last point I want to make relates to Kashmir. 63% of the American Muslim poll in this survey agree with Secretary of State Colin Powell's description of the Kashmiri problem as the central issue in Indian-Pakistani conflict. Now, the Kashmiri Americans and the larger Muslim community are very much concerned about political outcome in the area. And I think based on this study, some of us would like to propose to the authorities in the United States and to those who are genuinely interested in bringing about peace between Pakistan and India by suggesting an international panel that would consist of President Carter in the United States, former President Nelson Mandela of South Africa, and any men or women of stature in the European community to begin to really address this particular issue. So you can find that from this survey, Muslim Americans are now becoming part of the statistical America, something that Dr. Esposito mentioned. They are now beginning to be part of statistical America. And of course, as Dr. Bukhari pointed out to you, hopefully by next year, this time, most of you journalists will be able to go to your library and pull out a who is who in Muslim America in the event you want to do profiles, because you have background information. And you can also begin to know who to talk to when there is something affecting Muslims in America. You can look at small town USA and see who in small town USA is a Muslim leader. And I think the journalists, the scholars, and of course the philanthropic organizations like Pew have much to contribute to the scientific location of American Muslims in the American religious and political landscape. Thank you.
Thank you. Now it's open for questions. We have time. Yes, please.
Under impact of September 11th, the fourth item down, so over 3/4 of the people polled say American foreign policy in the Middle East led to the attacks. Do you find that troubling at all? Anyone?
So which page you are looking?
It's
Page at downstairs.
8. Oh yeah, 8.
September 11th.
Sorry.
That's it, right here.
This is the mic.
Yes, okay, let me respond to that. If I read, you're referring to page 8,
Yes.
and you are coming to item 2, just after President Bush, right? Despite their approval, 3/5, 60.
I'm down a bit there.
You're down.
Over 3/4, 79%.
Oh, 79% say American foreign policy in the Middle East led to the attack, while 2/3 suggest that a change in American policy in the Middle East is the best way to wage the war against terrorism. Now, this is a very strong sentiment among Muslims. I mean, before we had this statistical survey, some of us had the suspicion that this was the case, but we had no evidence to prove it. This survey really lent statistical support to the idea. Now, it is troubling. And I think what has to happen really is for the administration, whether this current one or any future administration, and of course the congressional leadership and all the other groups that are actively involved in political lobbying in the United States to recognize the fact that you do have a segment of the American Muslim community who entertain these ideas. But I think the Muslim community itself will begin to realize as this debate begins to unfold in the country that some of these perceptions might not be completely correct. They may be half truths, but the evidence, of course, will begin to come to light. And that's the way I would respond to it, that they want to go. Right?
Yeah. I'd just add something to that, which is that although in the aftermath of September 11th, many were shy of getting into questions of reasons why, etc., because to even begin to discuss it, people would then immediately say, well, you're trying to morally justify, what terrorists did. The reality of it is that there are certainly many of us out there who are experts on the area and are non-Muslims who would say that unless American foreign policy with regard to Palestine, with regard to the sanctions in Iraq, with regard to support for repressive regimes, unless some of that changes, it will contribute to the kinds of conditions that spawn not just anger at American foreign policy, of which a lot of people could have who still function in their normal everyday lives, but it spawns hatred and feeds extremist and extremist groups. And I think that part of what we see here is an affirmation or a perspective coming from the community in America that these are major issues.
Sure.
Two questions, but just to follow that up, could you point out where that 79% is reflected in the poll? Because if you turn to page 18, when you ask about September 11th and why do you think the United States was targeted for the terrorist attacks, only 30% cite foreign policy, 3% support for Israel, 1% the issue of ignoring Palestine. So that seems to be a bit of a contradiction unless I'm misreading it. And my second question is, the study does not address the issue of the number of Muslims in America. As Professor Esposito pointed out, one of the most talked about issues right now. I'm wondering if you could say why you didn't try to pin that number down, and which estimate of the many out there do you think is the most reliable? If this is the most scientific study so far, do we have no clue? Those are my two questions.
Okay, why not, my second part first. The population issue, that was, we were not dealing with that. Because in the project also, we did not raise this issue, that the population issue. And we understand that recently it become very controversial. But we did not address that issue with this survey, because that's not a survey issue. That's another, I think, the data from the immigration, some other studies are needed for that type of study. Here, our primary objective was to have the feelings and the opinion and the behavior of the community, whatever numbers people have in their mind. But this is a representative sample of the American Muslim population and how they feel and how they act and how they think. These are the numbers over there. And just for the footnote on the population, I think probably I have somewhere. I read this recent debate, and I was jokingly said that the Muslims are very consistent, traditional to some extent. We have, I think, Muslims were quoted in February, 21st February, 1989. In New York Times, and I have this cutting over that. First time, the 6 million Muslims in America. And that was the quotation in New York Times on 12 years before. And still they are being discussed. They are 6 million less or more. And maybe a couple of more years, that discussion will be going on unless somebody has very definitive answer for that. But basically, I think the objective of this study was the parameter of their feeling and their thinking.
You get the
Go ahead.
her first question.
Yeah, that's it.
How do we find
79.
the 79% versus page 18, only 30% saying the U.S. was targeted because of foreign policy? I just don't see where that 79 comes from, and it is a significant figure. As the
Okay, about this Middle East, the question of post-September 11, there are several questions we ask. If you go, for example, in a different way, one we are reading. On page 22, question number 49, how much of an impact do you think U.S. policy in the Middle East had to do with the attacks? Strong impact and slight impact, they are 79%, 63 and 16. So this is, we asked 18, 19 questions in a different way. And the first question you are reading about that, in your own words, why do you think the United States were targeted for the terrorist attack? Here again, that was an open-ended questions, and we did not have any answer for any options. Open-ended question, and then we quantify those answers in that question, particular question.
Just quickly to follow up, that's basically the same question. And so how do you explain that? When you give people a fill-in-the-blank answer, and they agree 79%, but then when they're asked to think for themselves and give an answer, only 30% say foreign policy. Am I missing something, or it seems to be a huge? It's not even close.
No.
Yeah, can I just intervene here? I think this is one of the problems with regard to trying to capture opinions of human beings. Because when we talk about foreign policy, we're dealing with a larger animal, foreign policy. There are those who will be concerned about Kashmir, Chechnya, Somalia, and others. So that universe might very well include 30%. But when you specifically address the issue to, say, the Middle East, all of a sudden the number climbs up because you have a larger number of people who would really identify Middle Eastern issue as foreign policy, whereas the universe is much bigger than that. Because if I'm a Kashmiri American, Kashmir might be more important to me than Palestine. That doesn't mean I don't like Palestinians. No, but you see, but Kashmir is very important. If I'm a Chechnyan Muslim, I may be very concerned about Chechnya. And if I'm a Somali living in Northern Virginia or San Diego or somewhere, I'm concerned about Somalia. I think this is how you have this skewing of the data here.
And another point also, that's the important thing. In the survey research, when you ask the open-ended question and then you ask the structured questions, in open-ended question when you ask and then we tabulate them, so the 30% are saying foreign policy, 14% are saying U.S. image in the world, also it's a foreign policy issue. Then they are saying that...
Why?
Image in the world. But image is due to the foreign policy. What is the?
I'll give that, Grant.
I understand, but there could be a difference of opinion. The U.S. support of Israel, and then ignoring Palestine. But then the huge 28%, they are not answering that open-ended questions. But it always happens in a survey research. When you ask structured questions, more people will answer those questions. When we ask the structured questions, then you get the more answer. There's the don't know and not sure, their number goes down. And very definite answer of yes or no, it comes up in the those questions.
That's can I say something? Yeah. I don't know whether or not I'm going to give an analogous situation, and it may not work because I've been teaching about 30 years, and I always tell my students I'm terrible with analogies. So if you don't see a connection, if you look at student reports at the end of the year, they're asked to evaluate faculty. You look at the objective questions where they have options, and then you look at the open-ended. It can be remarkable. In terms of the fact that you'll have a group of students who will be very responsive and detailed when they're given options in a particular class, and that same group of students, when they have open-ended, will put nothing down, or will when you look at their written comments, they won't seem to privilege, the kinds of points that they're making here when they're being focused. I find even more so when you do other kinds of surveys that, depending on who the people are and how much, the average person, this may be my own prejudice, the average person gets focused when you give them options, when you give them a kind of open-ended, whether or not they answer is a question, how they even organize it. And the third example I would give is I just gave a talk, it's happened to me many times, in which for a group, without getting into the name of the group, and I addressed 4 issues with regard to post-September 11th in a variety of contexts. And 2 people picked up on me after and said, as happens when you give a public talk, gee, you addressed those 4, you never mentioned women and human rights. Now, in some ways, when you put it that way, it's like, my God, how could you not, The reality of it was, if you had framed it and given it to me, I would have had a lot to say about it. But, you know, when people are doing these things, I think that may enter into it, that when there's a focus, they respond. And you're also dealing with your average citizen, too. I mean, you know, you're not dealing with, in a sense, somebody who kind of focuses on these issues and therefore is going to have at the tip of their fingers how they want to respond. But I'm not, you know, Zahid has experience with regard to this kind of testing, and he's trained in it. This is just a layman's attitude.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
In your poll that you conducted, have you reached a conclusion as to the number of illegal aliens in the United States who are Muslims? And have you, in reaching that number, had access to the government database which reveals that there are 60 million illegal aliens in the United States who do not intend to become citizens? And thirdly, do you have a number of the citizens who are Muslims in the United States that are American citizens?
Okay. No, first of all, again, Ms. I'll explain that this study is not for numbers per se. This is a sample of the American Muslim population, and we are trying to feel their feeling and their thinking, their opinion, and their behavior. However, when we ask the question about this 79% of the Muslim, this sample, they are registered to vote. And among 21%, those who are not registered to vote, a very big majority, they said because they are not, when we asked why you are not registered to vote, so their answer was, and here in this, so among those 21% who are not registered to vote, we asked, why are you not registered to vote? Page 9. 53% said they are not a citizen. For that reason, they are not registered to vote. And then there are some other reasons. 17% not interested, never thought about it, never got around to it. 4%, my vote does not make a difference. 3%, too difficult to register. So 20% some other reason. So in this sample, 21% are not registered to vote, and when we ask them, 53% of those 21%, they are saying they are not citizen. But we were not after numbers or illegal alien. These are the data, the government has it, fine, but we were just going through the national level from the community, the sample survey, and we are doing it in that way.
Yes, no, I just want to respond to our colleague here from the media. I think, I don't know where you get the figure, 60 million. I mean, that's almost 1/4 of the U.S. population. The 1 out of every 4 person you meet in the street here would be an illegal immigrant, if that statistic is correct. But I think the figure is inflated. I think it's lower than that. The figures, at least I have read in the media and in some of the others. I think the INS people would like to know how many illegal immigrants. Unfortunately for the United States, when people leave the country, they don't fill out forms like they do in other countries. So this way you can never match. And I think this is going to change. That's what September 11 is going to change. The Americans and non-Americans, of course, some civil liberties will fight it. But when you leave the country, they should have evidence that you are leaving the country, whether you are native or a citizen of the country. So this way, this 60 million, which is highly inflated, could easily be scaled down.
It's may I answer that remark? Since you have not, you indicate you're not had access to the database that I have had access to, it would seem that you would want to obtain access to that database of the 60 million, which is readily available in the District of Columbia. It would seem any poll that you conduct would have included an investigation of that. Now that database is made available to hundreds of people, not everybody, but an organization like yours, which has some clout, would be able to obtain that. And That is 60 million illegal aliens in the United States. Many of them having, some people think, more rights than the citizens.
Well, thank you very much. We'll look into that.
Thank you.
Yeah, over there.
Al Milliken, Washington Independent Writers. Since this is being supported by the Center for Muslim and Christian Understanding, I'm curious if any of you have thought about this, how this shows where Christians and Muslims are closest and most in agreement, and then also areas where they may be most in disagreement or farthest apart. And then I just wanted to personally comment, I was really surprised here on page 23, table 6, and the first two issues, the areas, not so much of agreement, but the 8% that disagree that the U.S. should support a Palestinian state, and 14% of Muslims who say the U.S. should they disagree that the U.S. should reduce financial support to Israel. My impression, I never really hear those views supported, out in the public said by Muslims, but I suppose there may be valid reasons why those that believe such things maybe tend to keep quiet. But then on the third section also, where 61% says the U.S. should reduce its support of undemocratic regimes in the Muslim world, I'm sure that probably most Americans would be surprised by that, but I'm wondering too if Muslims in the rest of the world might be surprised by that. In fact, wouldn't that, certainly the terrorists, but those that are in undemocratic countries, they might consider you infidel for not wanting to support them. Do you think?
I think these are some of the big issues that will be dealt with. I mean, we ourselves have been surprised by some of these statistics because the ideas we had in our heads did not correspond with reality out there. That's one thing that scientific surveys like this help you grasp. I mean, statistics have some problems, but at least it's better than anecdotal data. Now, let's come to the 8% who disagree, who did not support the Palestinian cause. There are some Muslims, who for a variety of reasons may not care about the Palestinian issue as some other Muslims. And you have those people, they exist. They're not phantoms, they're reality. Now, they may not come out openly in a media like this and say it, but they exist, they're out there. Now, with respect to those who feel that, the 14% who feel that U.S. government, those people are more likely to be those who accept the Oslo Accord and who feel that Israel is a legitimate entity in the Middle East. And that, even though Israeli government is blamed by Muslims and others for the treatment of Palestinians, you have some of these Muslims who feel that the peace process should continue, and then the only way you can keep the peace process is for America to support not only the Israelis, but a Palestinian state, and that the Palestinians should also get some kind of financial support. That's the only way I can read this text as I see it. But as I said, some of us were surprised by the figures.
About anything about the questions?
I just think that the support one is, in terms of undemocratic regimes, you could cut that a number of ways. I mean, I could see, in terms of like the 22%, figure, I could see some people basically saying, depending on if, for example, they or their family came from a certain country, look, that country really needs American foreign aid. Things aren't going to change, that significantly anyway, and, we don't want to have U.S. aid cut to that country. I mean, I don't want to bring up specific countries right now, but I could see people taking that position because, they look at it and say, it's not like the United States, if it cuts its aid, is going to change the situation overnight. And on the other hand, our family members are living in wherever, and this is going to affect their lives if U.S. aid is cut.
A very quick note on that, and then we'll deal with that question. This gap you are mentioning, the gap between the opinion of American Muslim community and the rest of the Muslim world, that should be there. Because I think that is very much there, and this need more research that the Muslim community here to some extent, they are becoming pioneer, and they are having transferring the values and what they are learning here and the resources they are getting here. They are transferring those values and resources to back home. So that gap is very interesting to study. Yes, please.
That's about this number here with the 79, 30, but I just want to make sure I have it right. Does this page 8 conclusion with the 79%, does this relate to, on page 22, question 49? Is that where this comes from, when you add those two first numbers together? That's it then. Okay.
That's the highlight. Actually, just 1 minute. The first 4 or 5 pages, just the executive summary, the highlights of the results. And those numbers came up from there. And then we put the whole questionnaire and all results in there. Yeah. And no, you have more.
Yeah, let him go.
Related to that, do you think it's odd? I don't know what the percentage, I'm not sure there's been a poll, but do you think it's, I would imagine that most Americans, non-Muslim Americans, would disagree, and the numbers might be the opposite of this, the 79% number that you have here. There might be a much smaller percentage of Americans that believe U.S. foreign policy is a direct result of these attacks. Do you find this odd because Muslims live in the same place with in the U.S. with the rest of Americans, and they have access to the same media and everything else? Do you think it's odd that they could be so out of line with the rest of Americans' opinions?
First of all, I don't feel it's very much odd because, for example, if any other survey data is specific the same question and what is the answer, that's another task. We like to do that after what we've done with the study, that we like to compare the analysis, the results of this study with other the ethnic religious groups and also the national. Then what is the answer from the American overall and the other groups? But I'm very much interested to have any comparable data. And second point, it could happen. Means I think the different ethno-religious groups on certain issues, they could be very much on odd with the other groups. For example, we have in voting behavior. The Afro-American community, they are giving 90% to Democrats, means the Democrat candidate, but the other groups, they are not going as 90%. So it could be, it is very much possible, I think, on certain issues, but I'm not aware of that on particular this issue.
All right, well then, let's leave that aside. You'd have to agree that every poll that's been taken since the war in Afghanistan started has been overwhelmingly in favor, every national poll. 90+% of the American public support the war in Afghanistan. 51% of Muslims. Okay, how about that comparison? Does that surprise you at all?
If you ask me, and then Professor Nyang could also answer. For me, the surprise was 3 surprises in that, personally. Number 1, 2/3 they are agreeing with the Bush claim and the government assertion that this war is not against Islam, this is war against terrorism. And only 18% are saying that this war is against Islam. So living here, 2/3 majority of American Muslims, they consider this war is against terrorism. Number 1. Number 2, 52% are saying that they have the experience of indiscrimination. That was also, for me, it was a surprise. On Afghanistan, I thought other way around. I thought the majority Muslim will oppose the military action in Afghanistan. But again, the majority, they are supporting the military action, and only, I think, 40-some%, they are against the military action. For me, the surprise was other way around. Yes, but please.
Yeah, I think, again, one would have to go back and ask relevant questions to really answer your question satisfactorily. The question really is, given the fact that, and some previous questioner raised the percentage of people in the Muslim community who are not citizens. Now, I mean, I think if you look at the breakdown, the 51% that we are talking about, as opposed to the 80-89% of the Americans, what you find is that out of that 51%, you will see that a large number of that percentage would come out of the American Muslim citizens who are here. Now, that doesn't mean to say that all of them fall under that category. The reality is there's a high degree of solidarity among the Muslims, and since the Muslim community is part of a global community that feels somehow conflicted by what is happening in Afghanistan. As personally, when I look at the figures, I should be expecting more opposing the war, but in actual fact, 51% seem to be saying that's the way it is. Now, unless we have a breakdown between American Muslims who are citizens and American Muslims who are permanent residents, we are not able to resolve this statistical conundrum.
Yes.
Just one brief thing. I think that one of the things, too, that comes into play is for many American Muslims who are, let's say, first generation, for them to deal with not going after bin Laden, that is, going in a very focused and targeted way, but to deal with bombing that's going to go on for a long period of time is a big issue. And I know before the bombing actually even occurred, you would hear Muslims here, as you would hear some overseas, be again saying going in after bin Laden is one thing, but when you start bombing, the question becomes how much bombing, because we don't know. Is it going to be limited or unlimited? How many days is it going to go on? And for many, there's the memory of what the fallout has been from Iraq, and more importantly, for many, it's the comment that not only Muslims make, but people like Mary Robinson of the United Nations and others, about the fact that before the bombing even began, you had a country that was almost bombed back to the Stone Age in terms of the effect on the country itself. And so I think many were concerned about the repercussions of that bombing on not only civilian population directly in terms of casualties, but you might say in terms of leveling the country even more. So I think that adds to the kind of complexity, I think, probably of a Muslim response.
Yes.
Yes, coming back to page 24, question number 54, I think this analysis is very much supported by a report that was published here in Washington, D.C. They have cited the information of CIA that India and Pakistan, they have been at the brink of nuclear confrontation, and the bone of contention was Kashmir. My question is simply for a definition of central. Maybe Dr. Sulayman can define the word central. What does central mean between India and Pakistan? Does it mean that India and Pakistan, they have to resolve the issue of Kashmir, or it means that central between India and Pakistan are the people of Kashmir who have to decide the future of Kashmir? Do they really need to include the people of Kashmir in order to make certain that the settlement of the issue?
Yes, I think when we talk about central, we are really saying that in South Asia, you cannot really have peace between Pakistan and India, and between the Indian government and society and the people of Kashmir. So that's one of the centrality of the issue of Kashmir. So, I mean, the whole history of Kashmir is well known to the international community. I mean, the issue has never been resolved domestically within India with respect to the rights of the Kashmiri people. But now that the United States has become involved in the issue, for the last 40, 50 years, the Kashmir issue was in cold storage. Now it's being taken out of the refrigerator and is being dealt with. And I think what people are saying, and this survey seems to be asking the Muslims, how central is this issue in terms of your scale of priorities? And it's a very important issue. The Kashmir issue is very important because if you look at the Pakistani presence in America, just yesterday, Javed Bukhari from the World Bank, former World Bank official, Burki was saying that the 1 million Pakistanis in America have a total income which is almost equal to the domestic GDP, the gross domestic product of Pakistan. So 1 million Americans from one part of the world generate more income than the total GDP of that country. That means to say, for Pakistanis who are here, who would want to see that there is peace between India and Pakistan, and who don't want any kind of nuclear holocaust, who would like American leaders to pay serious attention to the centrality of the Kashmiri issue, because they have much to lose. And by being Americans, they also have to lose, they stand to lose. But America engaging the region could very well bring Pakistani participation in the pacification of the conflict. And eventually the Indians, who are Americans, and you have many Indians here, millions also, they too are Americans and they have vested interests. This is why some of us who are actively involved in interfaith dialogue and who are likely interested in building bridges between these communities see that the Kashmiri issue, together with the Palestinian issue, could be resolved if the communities, in this case, the Hindu Americans and the Muslim Americans, especially Pakistanis, begin to really iron out the differences and then put pressure through the U.S. government on those governments over there.
We have a couple of questions over there, and then we'll come back to it. And then we will.
Actually, I want to go back to page 31. This question, the first question is very, impressive. When you're trying to find out about the religion and its impact on the daily life, that also might help to extend this poll to impact of the religion in their decision, in their perception of issues and their position taken on the issue. I don't know whether you had this or you have in mind about this, because when people are not, and we know in the Islamic religion, the mosque is mainly the main place of teaching about Islam, about the values of Islam, about what. So if only 31% are going at least one, which means the question is from where they are getting their understanding about Islam and understanding about the values of Islam and the position about Islam in certain issues, as you have been asking. Maybe it will be, I don't know, I want your comment on that, and if you have any, if there is a possibility to extend this and to see, because that will lead us to the education system and to the teaching of those values, not only for the Islamic ethnic group here, but also for others, and how that will help to bridge actually in the sense of interfaith dialogue and how to bridge the gap between different ethnic and
2 points I will make. First of all, in the next page, question 85, did you happen to attend a mosque for Jummah prayer or Salah in the last 7 days? When we asked very specific, last 7 days. So 49% said yes, they happened to attend that mosque. And 50% said no. Number 2 point is that also the other analysis will be involved, definitely. That's the secondary analysis of the all survey research. It happened, it's a general practice in scholarship, that we will cross-tab with these religious practices and then their issue positions and different behavior. What are the relationship? What are the significance of those relationships? And if we continue to some extent, that's the another desire to all those issues, then again study them. Maybe further, if we can extend this the program, we can study more and more on those issues. Yes, I'm sorry.
I'd like to ask Professor Esposito a follow-up question to the finding on page 23 about 61% saying the U.S. should reduce its support for undemocratic regimes. There seems to be a growing clamor for exactly this in Washington. Just yesterday, the Freedom House had its annual democracy report and endorsed exactly this. And yesterday, Senator Boxer had a hearing exactly on this topic. But so far, the United States has been status quo power in the Middle East, in the Arab world, Muslim countries, for whatever reason, oil or back during the Cold War. How likely do you think it is that this policy will change and that we will go after some of these countries that are our big allies there?
Well, I've taken a position on this for a long time, and I continue to. I think that the United States, in terms of its response to September 11th, in a sense, has no choice. If it wants to talk about containing and reducing terrorism, not doing away with global terrorism, because I don't think you can, given the nature of it, one is not going to be able to do away with it, but to contain. That it's going to have to re-examine its foreign policy. And I think the State Department, certainly Mr. Powell has hinted at that, and Mr. Burns, the Assistant Secretary for Near East. But whether or not it will re-examine its policy with regard to authoritarian regimes and also with regard to the Arab-Israeli issue, in light of a kind of political culture, history and political culture that exists in the United States. That is, regardless of what administration you're talking about, whether Republican or Democratic, there's a kind of pattern of policy that the United States has moved along for years. Whether or not it will do that's a real issue. And where it really gets difficult is the fact that for most presidents, their primary concern is what happens on their watch. I mean, as most of you know, when you talk to presidents or to people in an administration about policy, they're very often concerned about how will this policy impact my reelection? How will this policy impact on my party and on coming congressional elections? And you know, I just don't know. What I do see, which I think is interesting, is not only the comments that you just made, but also if you look at the kind of writing that's appearing more and more in the media since September 11, the issue is being raised more and more about our support for a number of authoritarian regimes. That issue is fronted far more than it ever has before, whether you're talking print media or you're looking at television. For example, the question of Saudi Arabia. You hear far more discussion, far more hard discussion about Saudi Arabia, you know, taking place. So it's certainly out there. But I guess I'm now getting to an age where I'm not, you know, I'm a little skeptical about, you know, when it actually comes time to do something, whether or not the government will be able to distinguish between short-term policy and long-term policy.
One thing, I was just informed by Press Club, our time is up, so we can entertain just one question. I have a couple of hands.
Just a quick general clarification. This is called the American Muslim poll. Are you defining that then as Muslims who live in America, since not everybody in the survey, if I understand it correctly, is an American citizen?
Yeah,
so it's not American. I mean, and if you go to, I mean, the voting habits one, which says of the 21% who are not registered to vote, half of those say it's because they're not a citizen. So does that mean that roughly 10% of the people surveyed are not citizens?
Muslim living here. That's very much.
Statistically, I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot for coming, guys.
Thank you.
Does anybody want to take a crack at the range of Muslims in America?
I think that numbers?
Yeah.
Well, I'm notorious for giving a certain number. I would say, I usually say approximately 6 million.
Yeah.
But I just don't think.
There you go. What's the accepted range?
The accepted range? What? 4 to